The first howl of winter pierced the night as Margaret Porter huddled beneath threadbare blankets in her isolated cabin, listening to the wind battering the walls like some vengeful spirit determined to claim her as its next victim. It was December 1878, and the bitter cold that had descended upon Abiquiu, New Mexico, was unlike anything the 24-year-old widow had ever experienced in her life. Margaret stared at the dying embers in her fireplace, watching as the last orange glow threatened to surrender to the darkness. Wood was scarce now, too scarce. She had been unprepared for how quickly winter had arrived, how fiercely it had established its dominion over the land. Her husband Thomas had always handled these preparations, but Thomas was 6 feet under now, buried on the lonely hill behind their cabin, taken by a fever that had swept through the territory 3 months prior. She pulled the blankets tighter, her breath visible in the cold air of the cabin. The pantry was nearly empty. The well was beginning to freeze, and she was completely, utterly alone. "I will not die here," she whispered to herself, the words a desperate prayer in the darkness. "I cannot die here." Morning brought no relief. The sun struggled to penetrate the thick cloud cover, casting a gray pallor over the snow-covered landscape. Margaret dressed in layers every piece of clothing she owned before venturing outside to check her snares. Thomas had taught her some basic hunting skills during their 2 years of marriage, but she had never been particularly skilled at it. The snares were empty. Again, she trudged through knee-deep snow back to the cabin, her stomach a hollow pit of hunger. One more day, she told herself. She would give it one more day, and then she would have to make the treacherous journey into town, storm or no storm. But as fate would have it, she didn't have to wait that long. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the stillness of the afternoon. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Visitors were rare in the best of times. During winter, they were practically unheard of. She rushed inside, grabbing Thomas's old rifle from above the door. It was loaded, but she had fired it only a handful of times. Still, she positioned herself by the window, watching as a lone rider appeared through the curtain of gently falling snow. The stranger rode a sturdy chestnut horse that seemed unfazed by the cold. The man himself was bundled against the elements, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, a thick woolen scarf wrapped around his neck. He drew his horse to a stop outside her cabin and dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. Margaret kept the rifle trained on the door as the stranger knocked. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Name's Kieran Hawkins, madam," came the reply, the voice deep and resonant. "I'm looking for shelter from the storm. Been riding since dawn." Margaret hesitated. Offering hospitality was the way of the frontier, but she was a woman alone, vulnerable. Still, turning away a traveler in this weather was tantamount to murder. "I've got nothing to steal," she called through the door. "And I'm armed." A chuckle sounded from the other side. "Don't doubt it, madam. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need to warm up before I freeze to my saddle. I've got some supplies I'd be willing to share." The mention of supplies made Margaret's stomach clench with hunger. She lowered the rifle slightly and cracked open the door. The man who stood on her porch was tall, his shoulders broad beneath his heavy coat. When he removed his hat, she saw a strong face framed by dark hair streaked with bits of snow. His eyes, a striking blue that reminded her of summer skies, regarded her with a mixture of wariness and relief. "Mrs." he prompted. "Porter," she supplied. "Margaret Porter." He nodded respectfully. "Mighty kind of you to open your door, Mrs. Porter. This storm's getting worse." Margaret glanced past him at the increasingly heavy snowfall and made her decision. She stepped back, allowing him entry but keeping the rifle visible. "You can stable your horse in the lean-to," she said. "It's not much, but it'll keep him out of the wind." "Appreciate it," he said, his gaze taking in the sparse interior of the cabin, the nearly empty woodpile, the thin blankets, the cold fireplace. Something flickered in his eyes, concern, perhaps, but he said nothing as he went to tend to his horse. Margaret watched from the doorway as he removed his saddlebags and led the chestnut to the lean-to. There was something reassuring about his movements, efficient, purposeful, but not threatening. Still, she kept the rifle close when he returned. "Your fire's gone out," he observed, setting his saddlebags on the small table. "Wood's scarce," she replied, unwilling to admit just how dire her situation had become. Kieran nodded, removing his gloves. "I noticed a stand of pine about half a mile back. If you're amenable, I could fetch some tomorrow. For now." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out several packages wrapped in oilcloth. Margaret's eyes widened as he unwrapped jerky, dried apples, and a small sack of coffee beans. "I can't pay you," she said immediately. "Not asking for payment," he replied, "just sharing what I have in exchange for shelter." The smell of the jerky made her mouth water, but pride kept her rigid. "I don't need charity, Mr. Hawkins." His blue eyes met hers directly. "It's not charity, Mrs. Porter, it's survival. Out here, we all need help sometimes." The simple truth of his words broke through her resistance. She lowered the rifle completely and set it aside. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kieran nodded, then looked at the cold fireplace. "Now, let's get some heat in here before we both turn to ice." He rummaged in his bag again and produced a small bundle of kindling dry twigs and pine needles he must have collected along his journey. Within minutes, he had a small fire crackling in the grate, its warmth a blessed relief after the bone-deep cold that had permeated the cabin for days. As Margaret watched him work, a strange feeling settled over her, not quite trust, not yet, but something akin to hope. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing the wilderness alone. They ate a simple meal of jerky and dried fruit, the fire casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Kieran didn't ask about her circumstances, and she didn't volunteer the information. Instead, he spoke of his journey, of the small trading post he was establishing in Santa Fe, of the rumors of a particularly harsh winter ahead. "Where's your husband, if you don't mind my asking?" he finally said as they finished their meal. Margaret stared into the flames. "Buried on the hill behind the cabin. Fever took him 3 months ago." Kieran's expression sobered. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Porter." "Thank you," she replied automatically, the words hollow after so many repetitions. "You planning to stay here?" he asked after a respectful silence. Margaret sighed. "I don't have much choice. This is all I have." Kieran's gaze swept over the cabin again, taking in its state of disrepair, the meager supplies, the isolation. He seemed about to speak, then thought better of it. "We should get some rest," he said instead. Storm might let up by morning. They arranged their sleeping areas on opposite sides of the cabin, Margaret on her small bed, Kieran on the floor near the fire with his bedroll. Despite her initial fears, Margaret found herself drifting to sleep more easily than she had in months, the presence of another human being, even a stranger, offering a comfort she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately. She awakened to the sound of chopping wood. Disoriented, Margaret sat up, momentarily confused by the warmth in the cabin and the smell of coffee. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window. Outside, Kieran was swinging an axe with practiced efficiency, splitting logs he must have gathered earlier that morning. A substantial pile was already forming beside the cabin. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white landscape glittering in the morning sun. When he noticed her watching, he paused and tipped his hat with a small smile before returning to his work. By the time Margaret had washed her face and tidied her hair, Kieran had brought in an armload of firewood and was stoking the fire. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said, straightening up. "Figured we could use the wood." "Where did you find it all?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. She had scoured the nearby areas for weeks. "There's a fallen oak about a quarter-mile east," he explained. "Been down for some time from the look of it. Good, dry wood." Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. How had she missed such a resource? Thomas would have found it immediately. The realization of just how unprepared she was for frontier life hit her anew. "Thank you," she said softly, moving to prepare breakfast from the supplies Kieran had shared. As they ate, Kieran broached the subject that had clearly been on his mind. "Mrs. Porter, I don't mean to overstep, but staying here alone through winter isn't safe." Margaret stiffened. "I can manage." "No doubt you're capable," he said carefully, "but this is shaping up to be the worst winter in years. Even experienced frontiersmen are taking precautions." "What would you suggest?" she asked, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "I have nowhere else to go." Kieran leaned forward, his expression serious. "Abiquiu's got a small community that looks after its own. I'm headed there to deliver some supplies before continuing to Santa Fe. You could come along, at least until spring." Margaret's immediate instinct was to refuse. This cabin, despite its shortcomings, was the only home she had. Leaving felt like abandoning Thomas somehow. "I can't leave," she said firmly. Kieran didn't press the point. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Then at least let me help you prepare properly before I go." Another day or two of work could make a big difference. The offer was tempting. Margaret looked around the cabin, seeing it through his eyes, the gaps in the walls where the wind whistled through, the dwindling supplies, the isolation. "Why would you do that?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by his generosity. Kieran's expression softened slightly. "Because nobody should face winter alone, Mrs. Porter. Not out here." Something in his words touched a chord deep within her. The past months of solitude had worn on her more than she cared to admit, not just the physical hardship but the crushing loneliness. "One day," she conceded. "You can stay one more day." Kieran smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then we'd best get to work." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Kieran patched the worst gaps in the cabin walls with a mixture of mud and pine resin, showed Margaret how to set more effective snares, and brought in enough firewood to last at least 2 weeks. By sundown, the cabin felt warmer and more secure than it had since Thomas's death. As they sat by the fire that evening, sharing the last of the coffee, Margaret found herself studying her unexpected guest. There was a quietness to him, a steady reliability that reminded her of the mountains themselves. "You're good at this," she observed. "Surviving." Kieran smiled faintly. "Had good teachers. My father was a trapper and my mother was Cherokee. Both knew how to live with the land." "And what brought you out west?" she asked, realizing she knew very little about him beyond his immediate plans. "Freedom, mostly," he replied, his gaze on the flames. "Space to build something of my own. The war left the East too crowded with memories." The mention of the Civil War made Margaret curious, but she didn't pry. Many who had come west were escaping something: poverty, persecution, or memories too painful to face daily. "What about you?" he asked, turning the conversation. "What brought you to this particular piece of wilderness?" Margaret sighed, the question bringing forth a flood of memories. "Thomas, my husband, had dreams of raising horses, said this valley had the perfect combination of shelter and grazing land." She looked around the small cabin. "We were going to build something bigger once we got established." "He had a good eye," Kieran acknowledged. This is fine horse country. You know much about horses? She asked. A genuine smile spread across his face. Raised them back in Kansas before the war, nothing finer than a well-bred horse. For the first time in months, Margaret found herself engaged in a conversation that didn't revolve around survival. They talked of horses, of the best breeding stock, of training methods. Kieran described the trading post he hoped to establish, a place where local craftspeople could sell their wares to travelers heading west. You have it all planned out, Margaret observed. Plans help keep a man moving forward, he said simply. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret awoke to find breakfast already prepared and Kieran checking his saddle and gear. The realization that he was leaving sent an unexpected pang through her chest. "You're setting out today," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Kieran nodded, tightening a strap on his saddlebag. "Weather's clear. Best to make use of it." He hesitated, then added, "My offer still stands. You'd be welcome to ride with me to Abiquiu." Margaret looked around the cabin. In just 2 days, Kieran had transformed it from a cold, desperate place to something more habitable. But when he left, she would still be alone, still vulnerable to whatever the winter might bring. She began, then paused, the words catching in her throat. Pride warred with practicality, fear with hope. Kieran waited patiently, his blue eyes holding no judgment. "How far is it to Abiquiu?" She finally asked. "About a day's ride in good weather," he replied. "We'd need to make camp one night, but I know a sheltered spot." Margaret took a deep breath. "If I went, just until spring, what would I need to bring?" Relief flickered across Kieran's face. "Just what you can't bear to leave behind. We can get the rest in town." The decision, once made, seemed to release some of the tension that had been her constant companion for months. Margaret packed quickly her mother's Bible, a few pieces of clothing, Thomas's pocket watch, and a small bag of seeds she had been saving for spring planting. She stood on the porch one last time, looking at the cabin that had been her home, at the small mound on the hill where Thomas lay. "I'll come back," she whispered, both a promise and a prayer. Kieran had saddled his horse and was checking the cinch one final time. He glanced up as she approached. "Ready?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, clutching her small bundle of possessions. Kieran mounted first, then extended his hand to help her up behind him. The chestnut horse shifted slightly, adjusting to the additional weight. "Hold on," Kieran instructed, and Margaret hesitantly placed her hands on his waist. As they rode away from the cabin, Margaret didn't look back. She couldn't. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of the horse beneath them, the solid presence of the man she was trusting with her life, and the open road ahead that led to an uncertain future. The journey to Abiquiu was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. They rode through valleys blanketed with snow, across frozen streams, and through pine forests where their breath hung in the air like mist. Kieran was a quiet companion, but attentive, frequently checking on her comfort and pointing out landmarks or animal tracks in the snow. By mid-afternoon, the temperature began to drop, and Kieran directed the horse toward a rock outcropping that offered natural shelter from the wind. "We'll make camp here," he said, helping Margaret dismount. Her legs were stiff from hours in the saddle, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. Kieran steadied her with a hand on her arm, the touch brief but reassuring. "You've ridden well," he commented, leading his horse into the shelter of the rocks. Many would have complained by now. Margaret managed a small smile. "I haven't had much practice at complaining. It doesn't accomplish much out here." Kieran's eyes crinkled at the corners. "True enough." They worked together to establish their camp, Kieran gathering wood for a fire, while Margaret arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of where the flames would be. The routine felt surprisingly comfortable, as if they had done this many times before. As darkness fell, they sat close to the fire, sharing a meal of jerky and hardtack. The night was still, the vast expanse of stars overhead breathtaking in their clarity. "I never tire of that view," Kieran said, following her gaze upward. "Makes a man feel both insignificant and part of something greater all at once." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Thomas used to say that God painted the sky differently out west, just to remind us he was watching. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man," Kieran observed. "He was kind," Margaret said softly. "Not always wise. Moving us out to that isolated cabin before winter wasn't his most prudent decision, but always kind." Kieran studied her across the fire. "How long were you married?" 2 years, she replied. "We came west from Missouri right after our wedding. Thomas had grand plans for our future." "And what were your plans?" Kieran asked, the question unexpected. Margaret blinked, realizing no one had ever asked her that before. "I suppose I just wanted a home," she said slowly. "Children. A garden that would grow more than just food, flowers, too." "Simple dreams are often the most worthwhile," Kieran said quietly. They fell into companionable silence, the fire crackling between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Margaret wrapped herself in her blankets and lay down, watching the stars through the gaps in the rocks above. "Kieran," she said softly. "Yes, thank you, for not leaving me behind." There was a pause, then his quiet reply. "Get some rest, Margaret, we've got a long day ahead." The use of her given name, rather than the formal Mrs. Porter, didn't escape her notice. It felt like a small but significant shift in their relationship, from strangers thrown together by circumstance to something approaching friendship. Morning came with a biting chill. They broke camp efficiently, sharing the last of the coffee before mounting up. Margaret found it easier to settle behind Kieran this time, her hands resting more naturally at his waist. The landscape began to change as they rode, the isolated wilderness giving way to occasional signs of human habitation, a distant wisp of smoke from a chimney, tracks of wagon wheels partially obscured by snow, the remnants of a campfire. "We're getting close," Kieran informed her as they crested a hill around noon. Below them, nestled in a valley beside a frozen river, lay Abiquiu. It was smaller than Margaret had expected, perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a central square, with scattered homesteads visible on the outskirts. But compared to her isolated cabin, it seemed like a metropolis. "It's not much," Kieran said, almost apologetically. "But the people are good, and they look after their own." "It looks wonderful," Margaret replied honestly, hope rising in her chest at the sight of civilization. They rode down into the town, the horses' hooves leaving tracks in the snow-covered street. A few people were out despite the cold, a man chopping wood, a woman hanging laundry that would surely freeze before it dried, children engaged in a snowball fight. Kieran guided the horse to a modest 2-story building with a sign identifying it as Jensen's boarding house. "Mrs. Jensen's a widow herself," he explained as he helped Margaret dismount. "She's got a fair price for lodging and doesn't ask too many questions." The interior of the boarding house was blessedly warm, with a large fireplace dominating the small front room. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from her knitting as they entered, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Kieran Hawkins," she said, setting her work aside. "Didn't expect to see you before spring." "Change of plans, Mrs. Jensen," he replied, removing his hat. "This is Mrs. Margaret Porter. She's in need of lodging for the winter." Mrs. Jensen's gaze softened as she took in Margaret's travel-worn appearance. "Of course, dear. I've got a room on the second floor that gets good morning light." The transaction was completed quickly, Kieran paying for 2 weeks' lodging in advance despite Margaret's protests. "Consider it a loan," he said firmly. "You can repay me when you're settled, Mrs. Jensen showed Margaret to a small but clean room furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair beside the window. It was the most comfortable space Margaret had seen in months. "Supper's at 6, the older woman informed her. "Wash-up rooms at the end of the hall. If you need anything, just holler." Left alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty washing over her. She had made it to safety, but what now? What would become of her in this unfamiliar town? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Kieran standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "I need to see to my horse and deliver those supplies I mentioned," he said. "Thought I'd check if you needed anything from the general store while I'm out." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her. "I'm fine for now, thank you," Kieran nodded. "I'll be staying at the smithy. Old friend of mine owns it. I'll come by tomorrow to see how you're settling in." "You don't have to do that," Margaret said quickly. "You've already done more than enough." A small smile crossed his face. "Maybe I want to, Mrs. Porter." With that, he placed his hat back on his head and departed, leaving Margaret with the distinct feeling that her life had taken a turn she could never have anticipated when she first opened her cabin door to a stranger in a snowstorm. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment. Abiquiu, for all its small size, was a far cry from the isolation Margaret had grown accustomed to. The constant presence of other people, their voices, their movement, their lives intersecting with hers was both comforting and overwhelming. True to his word, Kieran checked on her regularly. He introduced her to key members of the community: the doctor, the general store owner, the blacksmith who was providing him lodging. Everyone was welcoming, if curious about the young widow who had appeared in their midst. "Folks are talking," Mrs. Jensen informed Margaret over breakfast one morning, a week after her arrival. "Wondering about you and that handsome Hawkins fellow." Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. "There's nothing to wonder about. Mr. Hawkins was kind enough to help me when I was in need. That's all." Mrs. Jensen's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "If you say so, dear. Though I will say he's been mighty attentive for a man with nothing on his mind." The observation, while embarrassing, forced Margaret to consider the nature of her relationship with Kieran. He had indeed been attentive, checking on her daily, bringing small gifts of food or necessities, introducing her to everyone who might be helpful to her. But was there more to his interest than simple kindness? And more troubling, how did she feel about the possibility? The question lingered in her mind that afternoon as she sat in the town's small general store, mending shirts for the owner's sons, her first attempt at earning money since arriving in Abiquiu. "Mrs. Porter." The familiar voice made her look up. Kieran stood before her, his tall frame blocking the winter sunlight from the window. "Mr. Hawkins," she acknowledged, setting aside her mending. "How are you today?" "Well enough," he replied, removing his hat. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper this evening, at the cafe." The invitation caught her off guard. They had shared meals at the boarding house and in various homes where they'd been invited together, but this felt different, more intentional. "I wouldn't want to impose on your time," she said carefully. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "It's an invitation, not an imposition." Margaret hesitated, aware of the curious glances from others in the store. Accepting would certainly fuel the town gossip Mrs. Jensen had mentioned. Yet the prospect of spending an evening in Kieran's company was undeniably appealing. "I'd be pleased to join you," she finally said. His smile was immediate and warming. "I'll call for you at 6 then." The cafe was a modest establishment attached to Abiquiu's only hotel. It offered simple but hearty fair venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that the proprietor's wife was famous for throughout the county. Seated across from Kieran at a small table near the window, Margaret was acutely aware of the glances from other patrons. A widow dining with an unmarried man was bound to raise eyebrows, even in a frontier town. "You seem uncomfortable," Kieran observed after they had ordered. Margaret smoothed her napkin in her lap. "I'm not accustomed to being the subject of speculation." Kieran's gaze swept the room briefly. "Small towns run on gossip. It passes the time during long winters." "And what do you suppose they're saying about us?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "That I'm trying to court the pretty widow before anyone else in town has a chance." The directness of his response flustered her. "And are you trying to court me?" Kieran leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Would that be unwelcome?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Margaret looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band she still wore. "It's been only 3 months since Thomas died," she said softly. "I'm not asking for promises, Margaret," Kieran replied, his voice equally soft. "Just permission to know you better." Something in his tone, the careful respect, the absence of pressure, eased the tension in her shoulders. "I think I would like that," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. Their food arrived, momentarily breaking the intensity of the moment. As they ate, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: Kieran's plans for his trading post, Margaret's growing friendship with Mrs. Jensen, the upcoming Christmas celebrations the town was planning. It was the most relaxed Margaret had felt in months, perhaps longer. With Kieran, conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that never felt awkward. As they walked back to the boarding house after supper, snow began to fall again, large, lazy flakes that caught in Margaret's hair and on the shoulders of her coat. "I've always thought there's something magical about the first snowfall," she commented, tilting her face upward to feel the cool touch of flakes on her skin. Kieran watched her, a softness in his expression she hadn't seen before. "You know, for someone who nearly froze to death in her cabin, you have a remarkably positive view of snow." Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine mirth. "Perhaps it's because I'm not facing it alone anymore." The words escaped before she could consider their implication. Kieran's steps slowed, and he turned to face her, snowflakes gathering on the brim of his hat. "You're not alone anymore, Margaret," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not as long as I have anything to say about it." The promise in his words sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the heavy coat she wore. On impulse, she reached out and brushed a snowflake from his cheek, her gloved hand lingering for just a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding my cabin in that storm." "Best wrong turn I ever took," he replied with a smile that reached his eyes. When they reached the boarding house, Kieran took her hand in his, the touch gentle even through their gloves. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. Margaret nodded, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't been since her courting days with Thomas. "I'd like that." As she watched him walk away through the gently falling snow, Margaret realized that somewhere between her desolate cabin and this moment, hope had rekindled in her heart, not just for survival, but for happiness. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that became increasingly familiar and welcome. During the days, Margaret worked mending clothes, helping at the general store, assisting Mrs. Jensen with the boarding house. The ability to earn her own way gave her a sense of independence she had never fully experienced before, even in her marriage. Evenings often found her in Kieran's company. Sometimes they joined the community gatherings at the church hall, where folks would share music, stories, and news to ward off the winter doldrums. Other times, they simply walked through town, talking of their pasts, their hopes, the small details that made up their lives. Kieran spoke of his time as a Union cavalry officer, of the horrors he'd witnessed that had driven him westward seeking peace. Margaret shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, of her brief courtship with Thomas, of the dreams that had brought them to New Mexico territory. "Do you still plan to raise horses?" Kieran asked one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor, a chess board between them. Margaret considered the question as she moved her knight. "I don't know. It was Thomas's dream more than mine, though I did love the idea of building something lasting." "What is your dream now?" Kieran asked, countering her move with one of his own. The question gave her pause. For so long, survival had been her only goal. The luxury of dreaming seemed almost foreign. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to have a home again. Not just somewhere to shelter, but a true home, with a garden where I could grow those flowers I mentioned." Kieran's eyes held hers across the board. "That's a dream worth having." As Christmas approached, the town's mood brightened despite the continuing cold. Evergreen boughs appeared in windows, red ribbons adorned doorways, and the scent of baking permeated the boarding house as Mrs. Jensen prepared for the holiday. Margaret found herself drawn into the preparations, helping to decorate the church hall for the Christmas Eve celebration, sewing small gifts for Mrs. Jensen and the other women who had welcomed her so warmly. For Kieran, she crafted something special, a pair of finely stitched leather gloves to replace his worn ones. The project consumed her evenings when he wasn't present, and she took particular care with each stitch, wanting them to be perfect. Christmas Eve arrived with a clarity of sky that made the stars seem close enough to touch. The entire town gathered in the church hall, which had been transformed with candles, greenery, and a small pine tree adorned with paper ornaments made by the children. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Thomas had always admired, and had arranged her hair more carefully than usual. Mrs. Jensen had noticed her efforts and smiled knowingly, but made no comment. When Kieran arrived to escort her to the celebration, the appreciation in his eyes made the extra care worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The hall was warm with bodies and laughter when they arrived. Tables laden with food lined one wall. Everyone had contributed something to the feast, even those with little to spare. Margaret had baked bread, using Mrs. Jensen's precious supply of yeast. The evening unfolded in a blur of music, dancing, and fellowship. Margaret found herself swept into a circle dance, laughing as she linked arms with neighbors who had become friends. Kieran watched from the sidelines, a smile on his face that softened his usually serious demeanor. Later, as the celebration continued, they stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The night air was crisp, but not unbearable, the stars impossibly bright overhead. "I have something for you," Kieran said, reaching into his coat pocket. "It's not much, but—" He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Margaret took it carefully, touched by the gesture. "I have something for you as well," she admitted, producing the carefully wrapped gloves from her own pocket. They exchanged gifts, each unwrapping with deliberate care. Margaret gasped softly as she revealed a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "It was my mother's," Kieran explained. "One of the few things I kept after she passed." "Kieran, I can't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "She would have wanted someone like you to have it." His words caught in her heart. With trembling fingers, she opened the locket to find it empty, waiting for memories yet to be preserved. "It's beautiful," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you." Kieran was examining the gloves, his fingers tracing the careful stitching. "These are exquisite work, Margaret. No one's made something like this for me since I was a boy." The genuine appreciation in his voice made her cheeks warm despite the cold. "I'm glad you like them." He put them on, flexing his fingers to test the fit. "Perfect," he declared, then took her hands in his newly gloved ones. "Just like the woman who made them." The compliment flustered her, but in a pleasant way that made her heart beat faster. Kieran stepped closer, his expression growing serious. "Margaret," he said softly, "I know it hasn't been long since we met, and I know you're still grieving, but I need you to know that my feelings for you have become significant." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. In the weeks they had spent together, something had indeed grown between them, a connection that went beyond gratitude or convenience. But hearing him acknowledge it made it suddenly, startlingly real. "I don't expect anything," he continued when she remained silent. "I just wanted you to know where I stand." Margaret looked up at him, this man who had literally saved her life and then, day by day, had shown her that life could still hold joy. Thomas would always be a part of her heart, but her heart, she was discovering, had room for more than one love. "Your feelings are not unwelcome," she said softly, echoing his words from weeks earlier. "They're reciprocated." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her lips, brief, tender, a promise rather than a demand. When they returned to the hall, hand in hand, Margaret felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. The wilderness that had once threatened to claim her life had, in its harsh way, led her to this moment of unexpected joy. The days following Christmas were filled with a tentative sweetness as Margaret and Kieran navigated the evolving nature of their relationship. They were more open now about their feelings, though still respectful of the watchful eyes of the small community. January brought storms that isolated Abiquiu for days at a time, the snow piling so high that doors had to be dug out each morning. During these times, the boarding house became a haven of warmth and companionship, with Kieran often joining them for meals or evenings of cards and conversation. It was during one such evening, as a blizzard raged outside, that Kieran broached the subject that had been on his mind. "I need to leave for Santa Fe soon," he said, as they sat alone in the parlor after the other boarders had retired. "My business partners are expecting me by early February." Margaret had known this moment would come, but the news still sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "How long will you be gone?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," he replied. "There are contracts to finalize, supplies to arrange." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like you to consider coming with me." The suggestion caught her by surprise. "To Santa Fe," Kieran nodded, his expression earnest. "It's a larger town with more opportunities. And," he took her hands in his, "I don't want to be parted from you if I don't have to be." The sentiment warmed her, but uncertainty held her back. "What would I do in Santa Fe?" "Whatever you wish," he replied simply. "The trading post will need help with accounting, inventory, or you could find other work if you prefer. Santa Fe has schools, shops, many places that could use someone with your skills." Margaret considered the offer. The prospect of a new beginning was appealing, yet intimidating. Abiquiu had become familiar, safe. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. I won't be leaving for another week at least, weather permitting." That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind howling outside, she contemplated the choice before her. Santa Fe represented an unknown future with Kieran, while Abiquiu offered the comfort of the familiar. And there was still the cabin Thomas's dream, her last connection to the life they had planned together. The next morning, Margaret sought out Mrs. Jensen, finding the older woman kneading bread in the kitchen. "May I speak with you about something?" Margaret asked, accepting the offer of coffee. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Jensen replied, continuing her rhythmic work with the dough. Margaret sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Kieran has asked me to go to Santa Fe with him." Mrs. Jensen's hands stilled briefly, then resumed their kneading. "And how do you feel about that?" "Confused," Margaret admitted. "Part of me wants to go to see where this connection between us might lead. But another part feels like I'd be abandoning Thomas, abandoning the life we planned." Mrs. Jensen was silent for a moment, her experienced hands folding and pressing the dough with practiced ease. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle. "I was married for 32 years before my Harold passed. Loved that man with everything in me." She paused, a distant look in her eyes. "After he was gone, I thought that was it for me. What could possibly follow a love like that?" She divided the dough into loaves, placing them in greased pans. "Then 3 years later, I met George Jensen at a church social in Denver. Married him 6 months after that, and we had 12 good years before his heart gave out." She wiped her hands on her apron, fixing Margaret with a direct gaze. "Love isn't a betrayal, Margaret. It's a gift. And turning away from it won't honor Thomas's memory, it'll just leave you with regrets." The simple wisdom of Mrs. Jensen's words resonated deeply. Margaret thought of Thomas, his enthusiasm for life, his generous spirit. Would he want her to cling to memories at the expense of living? "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "I believe I needed to hear that." Mrs. Jensen patted her hand. "Whatever you decide, you have friends here now. Remember that." The conversation stayed with Margaret throughout the day as she helped around the boarding house, her mind turning over possibilities, examining her heart's true desires. That evening, she found Kieran at the smithy, helping his friend with repairs to a wagon wheel damaged in the recent storms. When he saw her, he set aside his tools and came to greet her, his smile warm despite the cold of the forge-lit building. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Margaret took a deep breath. "I've made my decision about Santa Fe." Interest sharpened his gaze. "And I'll go with you," she said, "but on one condition." "Name it," he replied without hesitation. "In the spring, before you open your trading post, I need to return to the cabin, just for a few days." She met his gaze steadily. "I need to say goodbye properly." Understanding softened his features. "We'll go together," he promised. "Whenever you're ready." The relief of having made a decision, coupled with the support in his eyes, made Margaret feel lighter than she had in months. On impulse, she reached up and kissed him briefly, unconcerned about the blacksmith's knowing grin. "Thank you," she whispered. Kieran's answering smile contained a promise that made her heart quicken. "No, Margaret Porter, thank you." Preparations for their departure to Santa Fe occupied the next week. The weather cleared enough for travel, though the roads remained challenging. Margaret packed her few belongings, said her goodbyes to the friends she'd made, and promised Mrs. Jensen she would write. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Kieran had arranged for a small wagon, more comfortable for the journey than riding double on his horse. Their possessions, his tools and trading supplies, her modest collection of clothing and mementos were secured in the back. As they prepared to leave, several townspeople gathered to see them off, offering good wishes and packages of food for the journey. Margaret was touched by the genuine affection, by how quickly she had become part of this community. "Remember what I said, Mrs. Jensen murmured as she embraced Margaret. "Love is a gift." "I won't forget," Margaret promised, blinking back tears. The journey to Santa Fe took 3 days, the roads slow going with lingering snow and mud where it had melted. They spent nights at way stations or small settlements along the route, always maintaining propriety by securing separate accommodations. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a hill to find Santa Fe spread before them, a sprawling town of adobe buildings, the territorial capital and trading hub of New Mexico. It was larger than any place Margaret had lived since leaving St. Louis as a bride. "What do you think?" Kieran asked, noting her wide-eyed assessment. "It's impressive," she admitted, taking in the scene. "Much bigger than I expected. It can be overwhelming at first," he acknowledged, "but it's a good place. Different cultures mixing together, creating something unique." As they drove into town, Margaret observed the blend of American, Mexican, and indigenous influences in the architecture, the clothing of passers-by, the sounds and scents that filled the air. It was a far cry from the isolated cabin she had called home just weeks earlier. Kieran directed the wagon to a modest adobe house on the outskirts of town. "My business partner, Michael Turner, owns this place," he explained. "He's arranged for us to use it while we get established. He and his wife live on the other side of town." The house was simple but comfortable: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small parlor with a fireplace. Basic furnishings were already in place, and someone had left fresh bread and a pot of beans on the stove. Michael's wife, Elena, must have been by, Kieran said, smiling at the thoughtful gesture. "They're good people. You'll like them." That evening, as they shared a simple meal by lamplight, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. They were no longer in the structured environment of Abiquiu, with its watchful eyes and social expectations. Here they were simply a man and woman starting a new chapter. "I should find my own lodgings tomorrow," Margaret said, breaking a silence that had grown slightly awkward. Kieran looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "You don't have to do that." "This house has 2 bedrooms, and it wouldn't be proper," she interrupted gently. "We're not married, Kieran." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You're right, of course, but perhaps—" He set down his fork, his expression growing serious. "Perhaps we could change that." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" Kieran rose from his chair and, to her astonishment, knelt beside her. "I'm saying that I love you, Margaret Porter. I know it's been only a short time, but sometimes life gives you certainty when you least expect it." He took her hand in his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not asking you to forget Thomas. I'm asking if you might find room in your heart for a new chapter. With me." The directness of the proposal took her breath away. It wasn't flowery or elaborate, but it was honest, like the man himself. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've known each other such a short time." A smile touched his lips. "I've been certain since the day you decided to leave your cabin and trust me enough to ride to Abiquiu. But if you need more time, I understand." Margaret looked at this man who had quite literally saved her life, then continued to show her through 100 small actions that she mattered, that she was valued, that she was not alone. "I don't need more time," she said softly. "Yes, Kieran Hawkins, I will marry you." The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but he punctuated it by rising and drawing her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the floor. When he kissed her, it held all the promise of the future they might build together. They were married 2 weeks later in Santa Fe's small Protestant church, with Michael and Elena Turner as their witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress of pale blue silk, a wedding gift from Elena, who had quickly become a friend. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the promises exchanged with genuine emotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Margaret felt a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place that she hadn't realized were adrift. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and adjustment as they established their home and Kieran finalized arrangements for the trading post. Margaret found herself busy helping with inventory, setting up accounting systems, and making their small house into a home. The trading post opened in March, situated on a busy street where travelers passing through Santa Fe would easily find it. True to Kieran's vision, it specialized in local crafts, Navajo textiles, Pueblo pottery, Hispanic woodwork, alongside practical goods for settlers and travelers. Margaret discovered she had a talent for the business side of the operation, keeping meticulous records and developing relationships with the artisans who supplied their goods. Kieran often joked that she was the brains of the operation, while he was merely the face. As April arrived, bringing the first real warmth after the long winter, Kieran reminded Margaret of his promise. The roads to Abiquiu should be clear now, he said one evening as they sat on the small porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. If you still want to visit the cabin. Margaret had been thinking about it often as spring approached. Yes, she said after a moment, I need to go back just once. They made the journey the following week, traveling the now familiar road to Abiquiu, and then beyond, toward the isolated valley where Margaret had nearly lost her life to winter's fury. As they approached the cabin, Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions: grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been found, and a sense of closure that had been missing when she'd left so abruptly in December. The cabin stood as they had left it, though winter had taken its toll. A shutter hung loose, and part of the roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. The scene should have been desolate, but the surrounding valley was coming alive with spring fresh grass emerging, wildflowers dotting the landscape, birds building nests in nearby trees. Kieran helped Margaret down from the wagon but remained beside it, understanding intuitively that she needed to do this alone. Margaret walked slowly toward the small rise behind the cabin where Thomas's grave lay. Someone, likely Kieran during his brief stay, had fashioned a simple wooden cross to mark the spot. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn wood. I came back, she said softly, just like I promised. The wind rustled through new leaves, the only response to her words. I want you to know that I'm all right, she continued. Better than all right, I've found happiness again, Thomas. I've found love. Her voice caught slightly. I think you would approve of Kieran. He's a good man. Honest, kind, the sort of man you'd have called friend. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered along the way at the base of the cross. I'll always remember our dreams for this place, but I've learned that dreams can change, can grow in new directions. As she spoke, Margaret felt a weight lifting the burden of guilt she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Loving Kieran didn't diminish what she had shared with Thomas. It was, as Mrs. Jensen had said, simply a gift, a new chapter. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and gazed out at the valley that had once been her home. It was beautiful in its wild way, filled with potential that someone else might one day realize. When she returned to the wagon, Kieran was waiting patiently, his expression questioning. Ready? Margaret took his hand, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip. Yes, she said with certainty. I'm ready. They spent that night in the lean-to adjacent to the cabin, wrapped in blankets beneath a sky brilliant with stars. It was a full-circle moment, returning to where their journey together had begun, but with hearts and circumstances transformed. In the morning, before they departed, Margaret walked through the cabin one last time, collecting a few small items she wanted to keep: her mother's china teacup that had somehow survived the winter, a book of poetry that Thomas had gifted her on their first anniversary, seeds from the garden she had tended. As they prepared to leave, Kieran hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go? We could rebuild here if that's what you want. Raise those horses Thomas dreamed of." The offer touched her deeply, his willingness to change his own plans to honor her past, but Margaret shook her head. "This place has served its purpose," she said, looking back at the cabin one last time. "It sheltered us for a time, it brought us together, but our future lies elsewhere." Kieran smiled, the expression warming his blue eyes. "Then let's go home, Mrs. Hawkins." The use of her new name still gave Margaret a thrill of joy. She climbed up beside him on the wagon seat, and they set off, leaving the valley behind but carrying its lessons with them. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. The trading post thrived under their joint management, becoming a fixture in Santa Fe and expanding to include a second location. They built a larger home on the outskirts of town, with room for the family they hoped to create. That hope was realized in the spring of 1881, when Margaret gave birth to a son they named James Thomas Hawkins. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Lily Alina, named for their dear friend, who had helped them establish their life in Santa Fe. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled around their sturdy home, Margaret often thought of that desperate December when she had huddled alone in a failing cabin, certain that the wilderness would claim her life. How strange and wonderful that the same fierce winter that had nearly killed her had also brought Kieran to her door. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked one such evening, finding her standing by the window, watching snow fall in the lamplight. Margaret turned to him, taking in the sight of the man who had become the center of her world, older now, with threads of silver at his temples, but still possessing the same steady strength, the same kindness in his blue eyes. "I was thinking about how the harshest winter of my life led me to the greatest happiness," she replied, moving into his embrace. Kieran's arms wrapped around her, solid and secure as they had been since that first day. "I thank God every day for that wrong turn I took in the storm." "Not a wrong turn," Margaret corrected softly. "Just the right one, taken at exactly the right time." Outside, the winter wind continued its song, but within the walls of their home, Margaret Porter Hawkins knew only warmth, safety, and the profound joy of never having to face another storm alone.